All right, welcome back. We will be covering quite a bit of ground in this lecture, going essentially from World War One all the way through the end of World War Two. So there's going to be quite a bit of transformation taking place on the world stage, and so we'll get right to it. If you remember from last lecture, I kind of left off talking about this culmination of convergence, which is beginning to really kind of dominate world history as we move into the 20th century, where imperial powers uh, expanded and began to bind the peripheries of their expansive empires closer to themselves, uh, so that they could marshal that power more effectively against their fellow European rivals. World Wars One specifically, but also the Second World War, are going to take a costly toll in that kind of policy or tendency. But at the same time, it's going to give more leverage to the people living in those peripheries, which we're going to take a look at, and it'll ultimately culminate uh, to paying off in the years following World War II. And so, what you're going to see here is basically a trend where, as a result of their sacrifice made, you know, blood, sweat, and tears, essentially, during these wartime periods, that they are going, these colonist people, these populations are going to say, look, we've paid our dues, figuratively and literally, in kind of fulfilling the obligations imposed on us for these imperial or sustaining the empires, and so in return they would want their own sovereignty, and they did this in a variety of ways, but it was a really pretty sobering argument that they were making. We'll also take a look at the non-Europeans that were participating in World War One. Among these include the Senegalese soldiers that fought on behalf of France. The Also take a look at the contribution of Indian troops, Asian Indian troops in the Gallipoli campaign, running roughly from February 1915 through January of 1916. But really, the key year, one could argue, in World War One is 1917. This is where you have the Russian Revolution occurring, which by the winter, or late fall, I should say, November of 1917, would see the exit of Russia from World War One, with the advent of the Communist Revolution and Lenin's, basically beginning his consolidation of power, transforming Russia into a communist state. Also, during this year, you would see the issuing of what's known as the Balfour Declaration, in essentially giving British support to the idea of establishing a Jewish homeland, which would also prove to be a conflicting wartime policy with the inroads and efforts that the likes of T.E. Lawrence or Lawrence of Arabia would be trying to cultivate among Arab tribes and populations, basically establishing the foundations of an Arab type of nationalist identity. It's also the same year that the United States formally enters the First World War as well. By 1918, roughly about a year later, the war comes to an end, which leads directly into the Treaty of Versailles, convening in the spring of 1919, which is going to redraw considerable portions of the world, as far as the consolidation and breakup of empires and the consolidation of new states. And it's going to kind of almost contribute to fostering more problems than you know resolving disputes. During the interwar years, we'll kind of briefly touch upon the independence movements, these kind of awakening efforts, you might say, that are occurring in Asian India population, but also we're going to see how, in the case of China, there's going to be a resurgence of kind of a nationalist identity, the overthrow of the Qing dynasty early on in the 20th century, but then also how this is almost immediately going to lead into a civil war between nationalist and communist forces. The interwar years, as far as kind of more Western oriented response to peacetime, is going to be marred or marked by enhanced disillusionment with the cost, the physical, mental, and just economic cost of the war itself was not fulfilled in the peace. Many people felt that Germany had not been um, you know handled appropriately, that they kind of got off the hook in many respects. There was no formal occupation of Germany, even though, and in the case of Germany, they felt that the peace was punitive towards them, that they were forced into accepting this war guilt that was formally written into the terms of the treaty itself. So no one really came out as feeling really good about this horrific war. There was also economic crisis. We'll talk about the Great Depression, and with the culmination of all that, kind of this disillusionment and the economic depression that set in during the 1930s. This is all going to lead to kind of contraction. That international powers are going to become increasingly isolationist in their outlook. That they're going to need to focus increasing amounts of resources and attention to their own populations. Some are going to take advantage of this, particularly the Japanese, as they begin to, late in the 1930s, begin to expand their interests. Actually, early in the 1930s, and by 1937, they're going to go to war with China. They will have seized by that point Manchuria in the early 1930s, kind of a northern province of China, what is China today. And they're going to go ahead and try and establish what they call this Greater East Asian Coast Prosperity Sphere, which we'll investigate briefly. Then comes World War II, and so you have basically almost a second round of the unfinished business that was left after World War One, and the culmination of these two catastrophic wars is going to really define the remaining focus of the 20th century. And so that's how we're going to basically look at it. With the regard to these conflicts, we're really going to focus not so much on the generals and the war plans and so on and so forth. There's quite a bit of material and resources available to look at, on your own time if you have the interest. But as far as kind of a world history is concerned, we're looking at the interactions of different agendas and cultures and so on. So that's how I want to try and look at this first half of the 20th century. With regard to World War One, I've uploaded some videos for you to take a look at. One of those is the Great War in Numbers. This does a very good job of giving context to the kind of total war aspects that World War One unleashed in Europe primarily, but also kind of had global consequences as well. So this is really the first war, you might say, that is really a mass conflict that is taking place with the hideous benefit of, or heinous benefit of, the industrial age. There are more troops here are going to die from the lethality of the weapons than from disease, and that's the first time really in world history that will have happened in the scope of what you might say is modern warfare. The high amount of losses resulting from this conflict really are the intersection of Napoleonic tactics, which is basically the massing of troops into these frontal assaults against an enemy that now was in possession of things like machine guns and massed artillery. So the lack of adaptation as far as battlefield tactics were concerned, combined with the increase in military technology, is going to lead to mass slaughter in many cases. Tanks are also going to be another sign of technological development, replacing the cavalry. So from this aspect, it really kind of conveys a sense of senselessness with regard to this war, and it's easy to understand, looking at the numbers, just how people would feel so utterly disillusioned and dispossessed after the war was over. The war begins, of course, in the Balkans. These nationalist Serbs have this convey this kind of or anti-imperialist undercurrent, and with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, of course, that's going to lead to this whole kind of domino-like effect, resulting in World War One. And throughout the war, France is going to deploy what come to be known as the Senegalese soldiers. These are black soldiers from French-held West Africa. Nearly 200,000 served over the course of the war to fight on behalf of the imperial interests of France. Some 135,000 of those troops fought in Europe, and they were involved in key battles such as Verdun, which lasted from February to December of 1916, and also in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. And some 30,000 of these Senegalese soldiers, as they were known, were killed. England, as I mentioned at the outset, used Indian troops, again for the same purposes, in defense of the empire. Over 1 million Indian troops served. Some 138,000 of those served in Europe. The others would serve in, as we'll see, in the Gallipoli campaign, but they also served in places like securing key strategic areas and points of interest for the British Empire, places like the Suez Canal in Egypt. Of those Indian soldiers that served in combat, some 62,000 died and another 67,000 were wounded. During the Gallipoli campaign, which was an effort by the British to secure a beachhead in the Dardanelles region to put pressure on the Ottoman Empire and try and close off the Dardanelles. This particular campaign lasted from February 1915 to January 1916. Some 15,000 Indian troops were deployed, and it really ended in failure for the British. After a year or near a year of campaigning. They made extremely modest gains, and after not meeting their goals, not having an effective breakout, essentially, they decided to withdraw their troops with nothing really to show for it. In the Middle East, T.E. Lawrence, or better known as Lawrence of Arabia, worked with Arab factions, again serving as a facilitator and an advocate for Arab nationalist ambitions. But by 1917, you have the Balfour Declaration being issued. Was the British government expressing its support for, again, the establishment of a Jewish national home, as they called it. This was an appeal to Zionist ambitions. Zionism being the belief that Jews had a right to claim a state, an independent Jewish state of their own. That idea, that concept, was voiced by early advocates dating back to the late 19th century, people like Theodore Herzl, and would be continued through up until essentially the official establishing of the State of Israel in 1948 after World War II. The claims that were made were based on the territorial holdings of what had been ancient Israel, and of course with the unfortunate history of anti-Semitism in European history. The British here in 1917 were feeling that they need to offer this olive branch, as it was, in order to elicit Jewish support for, again, these imperial interests that the British are trying to maintain throughout World War One. Of course, these contradictory British policies, kind of supporting Arab nationalism on the one hand, the establishment of a Jewish national home on the other, are contradictory. That they help to fuel the ambiguity and potential conflict in matters relating to the Middle East that are even being expressed today. Now, this is not the sole factor in setting the stage for these regional problems, but it is a contributing factor, and we're going to see how particularly Britain, but also how the United States is going to, in many respects, inherit a lot of the same kind of problems with regard to negotiate or cater to the interests of these competing interests within the same region. Also in 1917, the Russian Revolution occurs. At first, this is going to see the installation of a provisional government, but by November, the provisional government failed to take Russia out of the war, which was one of the key criticisms for against the Tsar, and also very quickly after the provisional government comes to power, becomes a criticism of the provisional government itself, that they tried to carry on the war effort against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. In November, the communists overthrow this provisional government. Lenin is leading that charge, with a small cadre of kind of an inner circle of his advisors and key supporters, and with the intent of installing a communist state. His slogan, or the party's slogan, of land, bread, and peace was the main core focus. They immediately turn around and pull out of the war. This allows German troops to shift the soldiers that were fighting on the Eastern Front against the Russian troops. They are immediately reassigned and redeployed on the Western Front against British and French forces. But just in time, the United States manages to not only declare war, but also get troops over to, uh, you know, plug the gaps essentially, and help keep sustain the line against the German onslaught. This kind of final push they were trying to make to have a decisive victory. When that does not happen, Germany has basically exhausted itself, and there's an agreement to an armistice that happens on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour. So November 11th of 1918, the guns fall silent, and by the spring of 1919, you have the major powers coming together. Major powers including France, Germany, the United States, and Italy, convening at the Versailles Palace to draw up the Treaty of Versailles. Those absent include the Russians, which had already sued for peace on their own terms, and also Germany itself, which was essentially just brought in to sign the document that was put before them. Now, the YouTube video that I posted up, the Impossible Peace segment, does a really nice job of laying out the major components of the peace treaty. It is very detailed, highly involved, and there are many parts to it. I'm going to do my best here to basically highlight the major kind of key points. First and foremost, you're going to see a dissolution of a number of empires and the creation of new states. There's the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, and the dissolution of Germany's overseas empire, particularly in Africa. And in China, the German possessions and territories held by German interests were seized and taken over by Japan. Another key aspect or term of this treaty included reparations. All told, this would tally to some $33 billion in US dollars. This was not only to include, and the documentary does a nice job of this, it not only included wartime expenses and the men and material, but it also included non-wartime or non-military expenses as well, that the Germans were to help contribute funds to grieving widows of those that had lost troops or lost loved ones on the Allies' side, for British and French widows. So that was something new here in this kind of diplomatic approach and peacemaking. What's also interesting, and I'll include the link to this BBC article, but final payments for World War I reparations were not concluded until the 21st century, in the year 2010. Some 269 billion gold marks were paid in total, and the article does a really nice job of explaining why it was that sum and why it took so long as well. So you want to take a look at that. Also included in this, and I alluded to this earlier, was the War Guilt Clause, Article 231 of the Versailles Treaty, in which it explicitly pins blame for World War I on Germany itself. What this did was to immediately undermine the legitimacy and the, uh, the legitimacy of whatever German government representatives were going to sign this document. It would immediately create a backlash at home within the German state itself against the government that had agreed to signing to these terms, and particularly to this war guilt clause. Um, Rank and file Germans did not consider themselves to be guilty for this, outbreak of hostilities, and really they lost faith and confidence in their own government representing their people's interest. So this was a particularly punitive peace for the Allied powers to conclude. And also, Germany was not part of the peace process. They were only given essentially an ultimatum, either sign this document or else, type of attitude that was taken. For his part, Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. president, brought his own ideas to the Paris Peace Conference. Again, the documentary Impossible Peace does a really nice job outlining Wilson's ideas and their reception at Versailles. One of the key components of the 14 points was this right to self-determination, and how it manifested itself into what was known as the mandate system. This classified territorial holdings outside of Europe, really, into A, B, and C classifications, which really reflected an unabashed racial kind of aspect to a hierarchical classification of populations around the world and their readiness to take on self-rule and self-determination. So really the mandate system is flipping self-determination on its head, because it allowed imperial powers to retain virtually all of their overseas imperial possessions and territories, saying, well, justifying self-determination by saying, well, they're, these our possession of these colonies, the populations residing there are not ready to govern themselves, and we need the time to, benevolently install, civil services and install the capability for people to govern themselves. And this even applied to the expanding imperial interests, particularly between Britain, or in the case of Britain and France, expanding their interests into the carving up of the Middle East, the creation of new states there, and how those states fell within the classification of the mandate system. Again, it was going to just built up increased resentment within those populations that fell under this mandate classification, and put increasing pressure on these imperial powers trying to keep the status quo in their favor. The League of Nations was also kind of another key component of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. This was an early apparatus in trying to maintain world peace via multinational dialogue. It really was ineffective almost from the start. One of the key reasons for this was that it was President Wilson's idea, and he presented it at the Paris Peace Conference. But reading the U.S. Constitution, Wilson can conduct foreign policy as the chief executive. However, it is the U.S. Senate that is responsible for ratifying treaties with foreign powers and foreign governments. So when Wilson, who traveled over there by himself without any congressional advisors or representation, when he came back from Paris and he starts to present this to Congress, the Senate does not ratify the treaty. And so, therefore, the United States was not a member, or would not become a member of the League of Nations that the American president had put forth as a strategy for maintaining world peace. So its strongest advocate was not even included in the membership. That lack of faith in the international community, as expressed in representative bodies of the U.S. Congress, is an early example of the type of isolationist but also kind of disillusioned feelings that many Americans shared following World War I. We'll get more into that in just a moment. It's also interesting to note here that with the U.S. absent from the League of Nations, that this also meant that there was an absence of one of the key players now in world affairs, the United States itself. And so this is going to undermine the effectiveness of the international institution. And it really would send a sign to send a signal to those within the League of Nations, those that were active members, to say, well, if there's a lack of commitment from the outset, then if I don't get my way when I am a member of the United Nations, then I will simply withdraw from the United Nations if it doesn't suit my interests. And that's what it exactly begins to happen as we move forward into the 1930s. So this infrastructure, this mechanism for redesigning the balance of power, it breaks down almost from its inception. Now, page 682 of your textbook does a really nice job of mapping out the breakdown and the reorganization of new independent states in Europe, and also in the Middle East. I'm going to pause here before moving into the interwar years and getting on into World War II. So stay tuned and I'll be right back.